Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Shidhish Kapoor. I'm the President and Principal of King's College London, and it is my great pleasure to introduce this evening's fantastic event to mark the International Women's Day. Now, I don't know for all of you, but for me, this is probably the first event in 2 years that I'm engaged in a live audience like that, and what a wonderful thing it is that we're doing it on the International Women's Day. Now, the International Women's Day is a hugely important day for us as a community at King's. King's now has a strong emphasis on gender equality, though I must begin by acknowledging that we were founded in 1827 and didn't quite get around to it till 1877. Now, I have to say that when it was founded, it was a college founded by men, largely for men, and it took us 50 years before we got around to the business of women. Now, it wasn't just us. It would be fair to remind ourselves that the University of London did not give degrees to women till about the 1870s. But when we got going, King's was one of the first places to invite women and enroll them in degrees. And not only that, King's was one of the first institutions to help women train for the civil service exam. The very first civil service that women were allowed to join was actually the postal service. And you had to actually compete in an exam to get into the postal civil service. And King's was one of the first places where you could come to an evening college, even though you couldn't get a degree at that stage, and start training for that exam. Well, we've overcome that history now, and may I just remind ourselves that close to 63% of our incoming students are now women. So we've come a long way. And thank you for that. But I was going to say we've got a long way to go. Even though 63%, I said, of the incoming students are women, when one looks at our professoriate, even though it is one of the highest amongst research universities, it is still only 39%. And even though we have the lowest gender pay gap, or amongst the lowest gender pay gap of the universities in the UK, sadly, it still is 14%. So we've made a lot of progress. Things have changed, but there is a long way to go. So a fundamental part of our commitment to gender equality is that in 2018, we established the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, which is chaired by one of tonight's speakers, the Honourable Julia Gillard, the first and only woman to have served as the Prime Minister of Australia. Through Julia's leadership, spearheaded by Professor Rosie Campbell, our institute has made an increasingly significant contribution to debates on women's leadership and equality in the UK and beyond. Indeed, as well as producing impactful research on a range of pressing issues, the Global Institute has hosted conversation with the likes of Hillary Clinton and has now expanded its reach around the world through a sister institute at the Australian National University in Canberra. Ipsos UK, with whom we are hosting this event this evening, have been a fantastic partner for the Global Institute during this time, collaborating with the Institute on previous International Women's Days to produce important new research insights. And we are incredibly grateful for their work on the latest International Women's Day. So with this backdrop of evidence and eminence, it is our great privilege to welcome the Right Honourable Theresa May to King's this evening. As you'll be aware, she's only the second woman to have... Sorry, got the only wrong. She's only the second woman to serve as UK Prime Minister, as well as the second woman to hold the post of Home Secretary, a role she held for longer than anyone else in more than 60 years. So we're delighted to host Mrs. May for a conversation with Julia Gillard about her experiences at the highest levels of politics, the obstacles she faced, and what we can do to improve gender equality and women's political representation. But first, we're going to kick off this evening with a presentation from Kelly Beaver, the Chief Executive of Ipsos UK, who will talk us through some of the key findings from a brand new international survey that her team carried out in partnership with the Global Institute. And after we've heard from all our speakers this evening, we'll have plenty of time for audience questions before you join us for drinks and canapes. Kelly, over to you.
Thank you. Real life people, it's amazing to be with you all tonight. This is the 4th year that we have conducted a global piece of research with Jewel, the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, which has cleverly branded itself Jewel. This study this year, we have focused on a range of topics. We've looked at how people perceive gender inequality around the world. We've looked at the issue of online harms and abuse online. And we've also tackled the thorny issue of caring responsibilities and how it impacts people's career aspirations and also their progression in the workplace. But the last couple of years have been incredibly challenging for women. There are multiple research studies showing the impact of the pandemic on both females, but also the progress towards gender equality. So please excuse me this evening if this is not the usual uplifting International Women's Day presentation, because we had to work incredibly hard to find positives from this data. International organisations are saying that it's not just 10 years that we have lost as a result of this pandemic, but 4 decades worth of progress towards gender equality. But I have one positive finding I thought I would start with tonight, and that is the fact that the majority of people across the 30 countries where we spoke to people told us that they believe gender inequality exists. And acknowledging it exists is an important precursor to action, progress, and change. But beneath that top-line narrative, which may sound almost positive, there is a much more challenging narrative that we see in our data this year. Whilst most people believe that gender inequality exists, almost half think things have already gone far enough when it comes to levelling up women, and actually they think we've made enough progress already. Men are more likely to agree that they think things have gone far enough already, and there are some serious issues in a number of countries where it's as high as 8 in 10 who think this is the case, particularly China, India, Russia, Malaysia, but also we see real differences in other countries between the perceptions of men and the perceptions of women. In Australia, half of men think things have gone far enough, comparatively to a quarter of women. So are we seeing a backlash towards gender equality and the progress that is needed? Well, this International Women's Day, it's all about bias. And what we do see coming through in our data are some concerning views. For example, 3 in 10 people globally tell us that traditional masculinity is under threat today. 1 in 4 believe feminism does more harm than good. 1 in 5 believe gender inequality does not exist. And in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, it's higher than 1/3 who just don't think it exists at all. And then also 1 in 5 believe that feminism has resulted in men losing out, both politically but also socially. Again, men are more likely to agree with these statements than women, and there are certain countries around the world where these kind of viewpoints are held more prevalently. Russia, but also a number of countries in Eastern Europe, so Poland and Hungary, and also Peru, Mexico. And this year, as we did last year and the 2 years before when we did the research alongside Jewel, we asked the question, what do you think the biggest issues are facing women and girls in your country today? And this year, as last year, and the year before, the same answers come back. Sexual harassment, sexual violence, domestic violence. The top issues are all linked to women's safety. Yes, the top issue varies by country. In the US, it's sexual harassment. In Australia, it's domestic violence. And here in the UK, it is equal pay. But beneath the surface of equal pay in the UK, we still see issues of women's safety coming out top. And beneath the surface of these issues, we can see some attitudes about how things are and how things should be. And those attitudes are concerning amongst a significant minority of people. Again, men are more likely to hold these views than women. 1 in 5 men believe that violence against women is often provoked by the victim. 1 in 5 men believe that women who say that they were abused often make up or exaggerate the claims of rape or abuse. And 1 in 10 men believe that it's a woman's obligation to have sex with their boyfriend or husband, even if she doesn't feel like it. In Australia, it's as high as 25% of men who agree with that statement. Real differences in Australia between the views of men and women, which it's worth flagging. And it's not just physical abuse and physical safety that are a concern today. It's also rising online, and we can see a rise in both toxic, misogynistic and sexist content online. In the survey, we asked about whether people had experienced or seen explicit content or content that was considered sexist or misogynistic. 45% of women say that they have in the last 2 years. And when you ask what's the most common forms, it is content or images which show that men are superior to women, or content and images which show that women are causing problems that men are experiencing. Those are the two most prevalent forms. But there are also significant minorities of women, significant enough to mention, who are getting uninvited comments on their appearance, uninvited sexually explicit images, or dealing with online abuse, higher than 1 in 10. And again, beneath the surface of these behaviours and this kind of experience, what we can see are views of what is acceptable, how things are, how things should be online. For example, 1 in 5 men, again, it's men who hold these views more prevalently in most countries, 1 in 10 men believe that it's acceptable to send uninvited sexual images that are explicit. 1 in 10 men believe that it is also acceptable to use sexist or misogynistic language online. And 8% believe it's acceptable to share explicit and intimate images of someone online who has not condoned that behaviour. And in some countries, yes, there's variation across the world, but in some countries, particularly in Singapore, but also Australia, we see real differences between the views of men and women on what is acceptable here. In Australia, it's as high as 1 in 5 men for each of these particular statements. Online abuse has an impact. We asked the people who had experienced it the kind of impacts that it had had on them. And it's a real mix for women of the silencing impact, but also psychological impacts, real psychological impacts. From a silencing perspective, women are either coming off being online or not saying what they think when they're online, so withholding what they really think. From a psychological perspective, it's everything from panic attacks, stress, sleeplessness, withdrawing themselves, and also inhibiting and causing low self-esteem. So it has an impact. In the study, we also looked at how caring responsibilities impact on gender equality in the workplace, and we asked about whether people perceive things are equal between men and women in the workplace. Only 44% agree that's the case. Women, it's almost just a third of people who agree that that's the case. And looking at the kind of issues that people are flagging, it is having caring responsibilities come up during the working day are more likely to harm the career trajectory of women than they are men. This is important when it comes through from the data, but one of the other key pieces here is actually, it's not just women who are experiencing challenges around flexibility in the workforce impacting on whether they take that job or promotion, whether they decide to apply for a job. But actually, people perceive, and there are significant proportions here who perceive that lack of flexibility in the workplace, not being able to speak about your family life, working part-time, they impact equally on both genders. So there is a sizable proportion there, and we can see clearly that flexibility at work is an important precursor for both women's careers, but also moving forward, men's. So, just some key takeouts, and Julia has promised she will make some parts of this day more positive. Firstly, there's still work to do. There's sizable minorities, but significant minorities of people who have some really concerning underlying views about how the world should be and what kind of behaviours are acceptable. Secondly, yes, physical safety is a real issue for women across the world still, but the rise of the virtual world is creating new challenges, and there's a real opportunity here for social media companies to step up and be proactive and create safe spaces. And lastly, the role of flexibility and the role of employers in a workplace is going to be absolutely critical to enabling those who have caring responsibilities to still make progress in their careers, because we will not be able to level up women in the workplace if we do not enable men to be levelled up at home. Thank you.
Big thank you to Kelly for all of that information. We will be discussing that later. But before we get to delving into those facts and figures, Theresa and I are going to have a conversation about life and being women in politics. But I wanted to start, Theresa, with something deeply personal that you might find a little bit upsetting, which is I'd like you to share with the group how you pulled up after the Aussie women cricket team smashed England. Nothing to say on that?
Well, all I'll say is I've just been on my first visit to Australia. I went to the first place I went to was Melbourne Cricket Ground, and I went to the Sport Museum there, and they had an interactive game that you played which tested your reaction speed, and I did that. And next series, I'm fielding in the slips.
Right. Right, you heard it here first. We've made news tonight. Our job here is done. But you have been passionate about cricket for a lifetime. You've been passionate about politics for almost a lifetime. You got the political bug when you were 12 or 13 and decided that you wanted to be a Conservative Member of Parliament. Now, that's a little bit different to my journey. Took me more time to work out I wanted to go into politics, but our careers in some ways have been the same. Yet, at the end of being Prime Minister, I decided to exit Parliament. You've decided to stay. Can you explain that decision and what more is it that you want to achieve as a parliamentarian?
Yes, I mean, I suppose, and in a sense, it is unusual for a former Prime Minister to stay on. When I went into the House of Commons, I was put on the front bench a year after I was first elected. So for the vast majority of my time in the House of Commons, when I came to step down as PM, I had been at, if you like, the top level. And I was in the Shadow Cabinet 2 years into going into Parliament. So, and I've always really valued the constituency part of the job of being a Member of Parliament. So I'd only been on the backbenches for 1 year. So actually, it has given me the opportunity to be on the backbenches, to contribute to Parliament in a different way, to choose the subjects I want to speak on, rather than having to speak on certain subjects. And it's given me the opportunity to see through some of the things that I started as Prime Minister. There are still one or two to do. But, for example, the Domestic Abuse Act, which I started the work on the Domestic Abuse Act, and that is now on the statute book. I'm waiting for the Mental Health Act. We need a new Mental Health Act to come through. But there are still things there that I want to achieve in Parliament. And I'm able to focus on some issues rather better than you can do when, as you know, when you're Prime Minister, you've got to do the whole lot.
And you are taking the opportunity to deliver the occasional zinger in question time too, so I think we should acknowledge that. But let's talk about some of the policies and big changes that you made in your political journey, in the many roles you've played, but including as Prime Minister. But I want to start with that really at the very beginning. I mean, you put yourself forward for pre-selection on multiple occasions before you were selected for a seat. I did the same. Took me 10 years to get pre-selected and one failed Senate attempt, so I know what that feels like. You've said publicly that when those rejections happened, you always said to yourself, I'm not going to take this in the spirit of thinking it's because I'm a woman, I'm going to use the feedback to improve my performance. But when you had the power in your hands to make a difference, when you were chairing the Conservative Party, you actually got in an independent psychologist to look at the unconscious bias that there were, in the processes. So you must have had the sense something wasn't being fair for women. What was that sense, and do you think it's changed?
Yes, I mean, I suppose just by definition, the numbers showed that there was a problem there with the selection. Our selection process, we needed to change something. So that's why we brought in the independent occupational psychiatrist, looked at the whole process, made a number of changes to it. And what was happening, I think, was that there was a very sort of traditional model of what an MP should be like, but how an MP should be able to act. So the great thing that everybody sort of put most marks by, if you like, was a great tub-thumping speech. They had to be able to go out there and really give it to them. Now, of course, you have to do that sometimes in politics, and women are capable of doing that, just as the men are. But actually, as a Member of Parliament, you also need to be able to listen. You need to be able to stand at the school gate and hear what people are saying. And actually, by and large, the women are rather better at doing that than the men. So we changed our selection process into one that balanced the different skills. If you like, initially just recognised that being a Member of Parliament requires a whole range of skills, and then tried to ensure that we were testing those skills. As you said, Julia, I didn't feel when I went through the selection process that it was because I was a woman. And I almost think if you allow yourself to think that, you're kind of playing their game. And so it's important to look at your own performance and try and judge your own performance. But I knew of women who had really difficult times in the selection process. So something had to change.
And playing their game in what sense?
Well, it sort of, how can I put it? If they sort of see the woman as not capable of being a Member of Parliament, and if the woman then feels that she's been rejected because she's a woman, it sort of somehow feeds into that image, I think.
Right, I understand. Do you think, how much do you think the bias is still there? I mean, when you do the statistics, I mean, in Australia, here in the UK, it is true to say that there are more women sent to the Parliament by the Labor parties, though, of course, the easy rejoinder here in the UK is to say Labor's never been led by a woman, whereas, of course, the Tories have been led by you and by Margaret Thatcher. But, you know, there's still a lesser number of women. Why do you think that is?
Well, of course, what happened here in the UK significantly in 1997 was the Labour Party took a deliberate decision of allocating certain constituencies as all-women shortlists, and that got their 101 women in, and that was that huge step change. I'm pleased to say we had 13 in 97, we've now got 88. So we've improved, but I think we would all say that on both sides there's still more to do, because the overall percentage is about 35% women in the House of Commons now. I think that there's, I guess, from a Conservative point of view, there's perhaps more likely to be a more traditional approach and more traditional view as to what an MP should look like. But I would argue that from a Conservative point of view, we're about opportunity. We're about enabling people to blossom and be the best they can be. And actually that should be as good for men and women, with no difference. So it has taken some time, and we still need to keep our foot on the accelerator. I think this is I co-founded with Anne Jenkins an organisation called Women to Win in the Conservative Party, which mentors, provides training to women who are standing as candidates, helps them, guides them through the selection process. When we founded it, we were looking for the day when Women to Win would not need to exist. But sadly, it still does need to exist. And I fear it will need to exist for some while to come, until we get to the genuine position where people aren't thinking, this is a woman in front of me or a man in front of me, but this is an individual. What is their skill set? Are they going to make the best Member of Parliament?
And, in terms of how people see men and women as leaders, I mean, you famously said that the stereotypical image of a man of a politician was a man with a wife and a Labrador, all of the sort of stereotypical images. But if we dig a little bit deeper than that, I mean, there is something going on, isn't there, with images of power. We've been living through this era of very hyper-masculine populist politics. I'm thinking here of Donald Trump, President Bolsonaro in Brazil, and now when we look at the imagery around President Putin and that kind of hyper-masculinity, what do you think is going on? I mean, it's clearly not all comparable, but there are democracies that are deliberately choosing that image of leadership. Why do you think that there's an attraction to that? And if we're in the business of opportunity for all, how do we diversify images of leadership so it's not that one template?
I think there is I would say, a real challenge, a problem in politics today around the world, which is this sense of it's a world of strong men. It's a world of absolutism. Either you're 100% with me or you're 100% against me. And actually, in politics, as in everyday life, you need to be willing to compromise, to come to sometimes to come to the solutions that can be put into practice. And I think that absolutism may be driven by a whole range of things. As the populist politics movement, if you like to call it such, that you've referred to, Julia, I think that social media plays a part in this, which has led to, I think has been part of what's led to a more aggressive, vitriolic sort of debate in politics today. And these things all reinforce each other. And so you get to this situation where that sense of somebody who is perhaps more thoughtful, wants to consider carefully and work out ways of putting things into place that actually benefit the majority and are really good overall and can be delivered, are sort of put to one side for those who just say, right, that's it. That's how it's going to be. And we are seeing today, sadly, where strong men can take us.
And having mentioned President Putin, it would be remiss of me not to give you the opportunity to give us your reflections on the Ukraine. I'm sure, like everybody in this audience, you are watching with horror the images that we're seeing.
It is absolutely horrific. And I think we should remind ourselves that it is an illegal invasion, an illegal war. Vladimir Putin has brought war to mainland Europe, but it's not his first invasion of Ukraine. Of course, he invaded Ukraine in 2014 when he took Crimea. He has, I think he has significantly underestimated the desire of the Ukrainians to be free. He cannot understand that. He still has the image of the Soviet Union. He cannot understand this sense that people have. But I think the huge thing one sees from everybody in Ukraine is that they want to keep their country. They want that freedom. They want that independence. And I think that this is what we're dealing with here is not just defending Ukraine, but actually defending the very essence of democracy itself. And I think there has been a concern that many people have felt that perhaps the West has been less prominent in defending its values in recent years. One could talk for a very long time as to why that might be. I think President Putin was an opportunist. A lot of eyes were on China. He underestimated the response of the Ukraine and probably underestimated the response of the West, as Russia is now experiencing in the economic sanctions that have been put in place.
And having dealt with him personally, has any of this surprised you? I think we were all surprised by the dimensions of the military action taken, but personality trait-wise, has any of it surprised you?
Well, of course, I think here in the UK, we're perhaps less surprised at anything that Vladimir Putin will do, given that Russia used a nerve agent on the streets of one of our cities in an attempt to kill 2 people. And sadly, one British citizen lost her life as a result of that. The fact that Russia has no compunction whatsoever in using a chemical weapon on a street like that. And we've seen we had the Litvinenko issue here. We've seen the Alexander Navalny incident.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody can be surprised at anything.
No. It's absolutely horrifying and terrific to have your insights on it. As we think about this theme of perceptions of leadership and perceptions of male leadership and female leadership, I think one thing that has always struck me as a woman in the public eye is that emotion is read differently from male and female leaders. So, an angry man is very likely to be viewed as strong, an angry woman is likely to be viewed as hysterical. A man who's been sort of moved to tears by a particular event is viewed as showing his compassionate side. a woman moved to tears is at risk of people saying that she's lost it, that she can't take it, that the pressure's broken her. And, you know, you and I have lived through some of this. I watched the day that you gave your final address as Prime Minister, and there was just a small catch in your voice as you delivered the last few words, and this was reported as you sort of sobbing. I know from talking to your media people that in the lead up to you exiting as Prime Minister, they would regularly take calls from journalists saying, you know, is she going to cry? When is she going to cry? You know, so this sort of bookie approach to on which day is she going to shed a tear. Can you talk to us about how that made you feel and what that is telling us about gender equality and perceptions of female leadership?
I think it's telling us there isn't much gender equality in people's perceptions of leadership, I'm afraid. And I mean, it is very difficult. It's absolutely true. And there was this sort of in a lot of interviews, people almost wanted me to say that I'd cried at various points on various issues. And yet if I'd said that, it would have been absolutely that, oh, you know, woman can't take it. Absolutely, you know, what's she doing there? She obviously hasn't got the guts for it, hasn't got the ability to do the job. It's a bit like, there was a book written by Alison Pearson some years ago with a character called Kate Reardon, who was in A Businesswoman. And I forget the title of the book, but it sort of ran through various things. And it had her at a point where she was in a meeting at business and she wanted to leave early to go to, it was either her children's play, school play, or parents' evening. And she was sitting there thinking, if I leave early now to do that, they are going to say, typical woman. If one of the fathers left to go to watch his children in the school play, what a wonderful father. So it's not just in politics. Sadly, we haven't quite broken down all those barriers and those sort of attitudes. But it is, you're absolutely right. You have to, as a woman leader, you're walking that sort of tightrope, if you like. If you're too emotional, you can't hack it. If you're not emotional, then what sort of woman are you?
Yes. And on the what sort of woman are you, both of us, I think, were very conscious of that tightrope. And I was certainly conscious of it on the final press conference I gave as Prime Minister, where I was absolutely determined to not cry or to not look like I was anywhere near crying, just to make sure none of the bastards got that satisfaction. It's channeling my inner Australian, you don't have to match that language. You know, but the effect of it then, when you're calm, you're controlled, when you've read the brief, when you're across the facts, when you're sort of focusing as much as you can to get it out as accurately as you can, then the criticism comes, you're robotic, devoid of emotion. You were referred to constantly as the Maybot, and I didn't get a nickname like that, but robotic was a word very, very routinely used. And looking back on it now, I can't even disaggregate in my own head how much of that is, you know, because I was being so cautious about getting things right, how much of it is this, you know, narrow pathway women have got to weave between sort of strength and empathy, and if you fall off one side or the other, you're in a lot of trouble. How do you reflect back on those things now in terms of your own performance?
Yes, I mean, and I think the answer is it's a mixture of those things that leads to that. And it's, I suppose what I found frustrating about it was, from my point of view, I was always just trying to, as you've just said, be as accurate as possible, be sort of as clear as possible, not sort of try to fudge issues, but be careful so you didn't give people the wrong impression one way or another. And to me, that was about being more professional, actually, in the job. But somehow, a lot of people didn't want the professional. They wanted something else there. And therefore, if you didn't give that, what I suppose they would say was the sort of human side of it, then the robotic, the Maybot, that sort of description was used. But the trouble is, as we've just been discussing, if you gave the kind of human side of it, when you're a woman, then that tends to be pounced on far more and not seen as the positive that it should be, or that it could be or would be in the case sometimes of some of the men. So, looking back on it, should I have perhaps cracked a few more jokes with some of the media sometimes? But then actually there was a bit of me that thinks, well, if you do that, are they going to misinterpret that? How are they going to, you know, you're constantly thinking this through in case what comes out is completely different to the way you'd intended it.
Yes, yes. Yeah, a joke that went badly would be.
Yes, exactly.
And I think one thing people don't appreciate from the outside so much is often these days in press conferences, actually no one's looking back at you. So, you know, because all of the journos are hunched over their phones because they're waiting for the latest flash, you know, so that they can get you on the grab. You know, did you know 20 seconds ago one of your ministers said X? Well, obviously I don't, because I've been standing here for more than 20 seconds. But, you know, that's what they're looking for. So you're actually delivering lines to just a sea of bowed heads. So it's hard to get a bounce off it in a human sense. I want to take you now to some of the policy work that you did. Neither of us have had to personally manage work and family life and having children and careers, but literally billions of women around the world do, including the women in this audience. And we're all trying to strive for the public policy choices and the corporate choices that would make that, the university choices that would make that easier. As Home Secretary, you put in place the right to request flexible work in the UK. Can you talk to us about what motivated you around that and how you're thinking now about the world of flexible work, given the pandemic has taught us that there are all of these different ways of working than we saw before?
Yes, I mean, it was talking to women when I was doing the sort of policy role. I was Minister for Women and Equalities at various, I did it in opposition and in government. This whole issue of caring responsibilities was constantly coming up as one of the challenges that women particularly had in relation to managing the workplace. And that's what led into the concept of the right to request flexible working, to just give that ability to be able to manage your time somewhat better with other responsibilities that you might have. And a lot of women today find themselves not just with childcare responsibilities, but sometimes with elderly parents' caring responsibilities as well. They're sandwiched between those two. So that flexible working was, and the right to request it, was an attempt to find a way to give some ability for that to take place. What was interesting about flexible working is that very often, at a very senior level in business, managers would recognise the importance of it, but middle management did not like it. It was middle management that found it most difficult. And I think it was because often for middle management, presence in the office was their way of judging your output, rather than actually having to judge the output on its own sake. So if you were in the office, you were working. The fact that you might actually be flexibly working, be at home and produce as much and as good an output as in the office was sort of, they found difficult to comprehend. What has happened, of course, in the pandemic is that's turned it all on its head, because now everybody has found that they can, unless they're doing a very practical, physical job, they're able to work at home. I always say to people, when I was a child, Zoom was a nice lolly, and now it's a major means of international communication. But there's a kind of, so there's a positive to this. It can be done, so hopefully more managers will recognise now, and I think we'll see flexibility being offered for all in a way that it wasn't previously. But there's a potential negative here for women, I think, which we have to beware, which is that if more women use that than the men, and so more of the women are not physically present in offices, being seen by senior management, able to have the conversations around the coffee machine, then there's a potential that they will lose out. And can I tell you a wonderful story about a woman I met actually in Australia,
Yes.
who worked for a company. She worked out the time that the chief executive arrived in the office every Monday morning. And so she made sure that she got there a little before that time. She waited by the lifts until she saw the chief executive walk in. Then she pressed the lift button, and lo and behold, they always went up in the lift together, and her career blossomed. So, but that's about women actually seeing the opportunities to make the most of that physical presence. And I think there's a danger if we see a lot of women rightfully doing the flexible working and seeing that as a way to better manage their responsibilities, but perhaps forgetting that out of sight can be out of mind.
Yeah, this is actually a big stream of research work for us at the Global Institute now. How do we harness the possibilities of virtual work without this downside? And we've also spent quite a lot of time on gender pay gap reporting. We've been doing comparative studies. When I say we, I actually mean the research staff. I don't do anything except bask in their glory. But the researchers have been doing a lot of comparative work on gender pay gap reporting and what it looks like in different countries and how good it is. But with the introduction of it, can you tell us what motivated you there and how hard a fight was it?
It was quite, look, I'm going to be entirely honest. Initially, I had to be persuaded about the reporting because I suppose I always thought overall figures were fine, but actually a concern as to was this going to be too difficult for businesses to actually be able to produce these figures in a way that was going to be meaningful. But we worked it through and we found a way of doing that. And it, I think, has been incredibly important. And of course, you know, what was the organisation that hit the headlines for its huge gender pay gap? The BBC. Mm-hmm. So it shone a light on things that nobody had even thought it would shine a light on, I think. So it was, but it was quite a battle to get it through. But I think it has been proved to be right. I wanted to go further and introduce ethnicity pay gap reporting. And we had that sort of in train. Sadly, it hasn't been followed through. But I will still press on that. And actually, I think these days, a lot of businesses are further ahead than governments on some of these issues. Because I think a lot of businesses recognise that there is now a generation of young people, not just women, but young men and young women coming through into the workplace who are requiring, they want companies to be providing these opportunities, the flexible working, the diversity, and so forth. To be the employers. I was interested in one of the points that Kelly made, the importance of employers in a lot of these issues. But there are employers out there who are starting to recognise that. Sometimes it takes governments a little time to catch up with them.
I want to take you now to a few other pieces of research which are well known in the gender field. There's good research showing that women face a glass cliff, which means that they're most likely to get opportunities to lead in the midst of a crisis. And there's also research that shows we are suckers for confident, charismatic men, that people assume that they will be good leaders, even though confidence and charisma are not correlated with positive leadership outcomes. Does any of that seem right to you?
I think, how can I put this? Look, I think it's interesting. The world in which we live today is much more a world of celebrity and a world where personality is sort of valued. I think actually for most voters, they just want their politicians to understand what they need and get on and deliver for them and get on and do the job. But that, in today's world, that's not what sort of fits in an overall sense, and that sense of charisma is writ large in people's expectations today. I think that you're absolutely right, of course. Women often find themselves in leadership roles at times of, you said crisis, but times of great challenge. Can't think of anybody who's found herself in that role. And it's the same in businesses.
Yes.
There's a kind of, often there's a sort of, God, the business is going under. What have we tried? We've tried this. Let's try a woman. Not done that one before. So there's an element of that in business and in politics, I think. But I actually think for the electors, they just want politicians who are going to deliver for them, understand what the issues are, find ways through them, and find ways to improve their life, which is what we're all in politics for.
Absolutely. Now, there's also research which shows that men who have constantly messy hair, oh no, actually that study's still being peer reviewed, so we can't do that one tonight, but we can move on with some real facts and figures. So I'm going to invite Kelly to come back on the stage. This is the part where we talk some additional research, not the messy hair research, but the research that you've seen. I wanted to really start with you and just say, when you saw Kelly's presentation and you saw the material before, was there any of it that shocked you? Was it in line with what you would have guessed if you'd asked those questions, or is it a bit worse?
I think it was probably a bit worse than I would have hoped it would have been. I think some of the things that particularly shocked me were around the violence issues and the attitudes to violence, and that sense that, you know, women who have suffered from sexual violence and rape, often, I think there was a figure there, people think they often exaggerate this. And this goes absolutely to the core of why it has been so difficult over the years to get these crimes of domestic abuse, of rape, of sexual violence actually dealt with by the police and prosecuted and people taken through the courts. And we have issues today about the numbers, still have issues today about the numbers, but it's that sense of, can you actually believe them, which has underpinned so much, and that negative approach has taken so long, and we're still not over it completely yet. And obviously the figures showed that.
And what, Kelly, you're obviously, this is your work day in, day out, is looking at polling research, but when you saw these numbers came in, were you shocked by them, or was it sort of in the zone of what you would have expected?
So I was mostly upset because I like to deliver quite a positive narrative for International Women's Day, and that was definitely not what the figures were showing. I think the underlying biases that I highlighted, if you think people are responding to those questions, the numbers will be higher in real life because not everybody will want to acknowledge that they have those biases. So when they're presented with those questions, the numbers that I've showed you tonight are the best case scenario in terms of the level of prevalence. So I guess that was something, because some of the numbers in particular for Australia, Julia, where we can see it's substantively higher than other countries on the biases from an online perspective and what's acceptable. I think there are some real issues there. So yes, shocked and disappointed that there weren't more positives to share.
And you've just been in Australia, and I think one of the things you were talking about when you were there was, you know, actions that political parties can take to encourage more women with the exchange with the Conservative Party in Australia. I mean, what did you get any sense? I mean, often outsiders, I mean, being Australian, it's hard for me to be as analytical about my own country, but did you get any sense that things were a bit different there from how they are here? I mean, the figures are showing that.
Yes, and I just got that sense that perhaps things hadn't moved as far forward as they have here in terms of approaches, certainly in getting women into politics. I think one of the main things I actually ended up looking at was process, because that's what we did here some years ago, as we've described earlier, is looked at the process to make sure that was genuinely being fair to women as well as men. I think that there is quite a lot to be done in Australia in that sense. But I was, if I'm honest, I was a little surprised at the extent to which the Australian figures differed from the other figures.
Yeah. So, well, I think we were on some of those counts. The online side of things, I think, where men and women in Australia have very different perspectives on what's appropriate and what's less appropriate. But some of the domestic violence issues there are more well rehearsed, actually. And so that statistic coming out top was less of a surprise.
And you know, having seen these statistics, I mean, we're here on the eve of International Women's Day, so really it's about thinking, how can we change them? So if you do that research in years to come, the results are quite different. How do you think about that? You're obviously very keen to see social media companies react to this kind of agenda.
I think so, but also one of the main challenges we have is often we have wonderful rooms like this, sharing data like I've shared today, but a sea of women and not more men. There are some wonderful men in this audience. Thank you so much for coming tonight and listening to me talk about men's views. But obviously they
took that compliment well. Did you see them?
Yeah, I know. But I think we definitely need men to be more part of this conversation, whether it's about domestic violence, online abuse, harassment, or the conversation about flexibility in the workforce. So I think having more men in rooms like this would be a great starting point.
And there was some sense in the figures that some of the negative attitudes, that you were very clear in your presentation that the split between men and women, but there's some sense in some of the figures, aren't there, that younger people actually giving worse answers.
Yeah.
Can you unpack that for us a little bit?
Yes, so again, for some of the sentiment questions where we're trying to unpick some of the bias statements, but also views on whether progress towards gender equality has gone far enough. There are more young people in the sort of 18 to 25 category who would agree with some of these sentiments more than their older counterparts. And we think there might be some kind of generational piece there where they just haven't lived through some of the life events yet, where you really do start to see that bias appear, like when you have a family, when you're moving in your career. And so they have yet to form their true understanding of the extent to which gender equality is not properly running throughout our society. So I think there is something about the life events they haven't yet experienced. They're full of the joys of spring still.
Right. Well, that's a better explanation than it's a more conservative generation coming along on these questions.
Hopeful.
Yeah, I think that's a good explanation. I am going to just go out now for a few audience questions and then come back with some concluding remarks. So we did say that we would take a couple of audience questions. As I know we've got Jude in the front, and I know we've got some budding politicians here. So if any of our budding politicians want to ask a question, I'm certainly going to give them the call. But Jude, so right in the front here. So Jude Kelly from Women of the World.
Theresa.
Yes.
I think it's marvellous that you're on the backbenches. I wish you'd been Prime Minister during COVID, but that's another matter. But I think it's fantastic in terms of showing that politics isn't just about how much power can you have. And it's a really important message. And so the other thing I wanted to ask really was whether or not you feel, now that you, if you like, distributed your power differently, do you feel that you're more liberated to have the courage of your convictions without looking over your shoulder as much? Because the statistic that Kelly's just shown would make any leader a bit guarded about talking about equality, because there's clearly enough people, mainly men, but women too, who would feel hostile towards that. Now that you haven't got to keep them happy, do you feel that you can be clearer about what you believe in and go forward with more, with more courage?
That's an interesting question, Jude, and I'm tempted to say I hope that throughout my career there have been certain things that I've been promoting in terms of ideas and policies. I'm now able perhaps to speak about them slightly more freely without the constraints of perhaps a particular ministerial position on the issue. But I think that of course, politicians doing things that are popular, that's going to be good for them, and they're likely to get the votes. But politicians must also do the things they believe are right, even if on the surface they don't appear to be popular. And actually, yes, those figures give us, give concern for the number of people who would not want to be hearing their politicians talking about equality and continuing to promote the interests and rights of women. But actually, there's a huge silent majority there who will be thinking, yes, go on, carry on with this. But what matters is it the right thing to do? And that's, I think, what we must all, as politicians, ask ourselves. And to me, politics isn't about power, it's about service. And I think if you think of it as service, then you approach things in a slightly different way.
Okay. We've got some hands right up the back there. We might take those two questions and then Carmen, I'm going to discriminate in favour of an Australian, the bright orange jacket, but right up the back at the moment. Can you keep your hands up? Yep, great.
Hello, my name's Karen Fraser and I work at Ipsos. If you ask young people in polls today then what they'd like to be in the future in their careers, the number one answer is an online influencer on social media. I think that's a big problem because it leads to celebrity politics and the rise of the sorts of people that we were discussing earlier. What do you think we can do to encourage more young people into politics?
Okay. And we'll take the question directly in front. We'll take both of them. Thank you.
Thank you. So my name's Claire. I'm not a budding politician. I'm studying organisational culture at the moment. And I was really interested, Theresa, to hear about the work on process to involve women in politics. But of course, there are cultural barriers that are being spoken about in House of Parliament, whether that's late working hours in the evening or being away from home or some of the behaviours that get demonstrated. And I'd be interested in your thoughts about how organisational culture within Parliament, but more generally, might support women's involvement.
Well, I think in a sense, both these questions elide into one another because the issue that you've just raised there relates also to getting more women involved in politics and wanting to be involved in politics. I mean, I think one of the... this is a very trite thing to say. The first thing is women need to see other women in politics. They need to see women actually doing the job and not just able to do the job, but doing the job well and presenting it as a positive. I think it's the best job in the world. And I think it's important to get those messages out of what a positive change you can make about people's lives as a Member of Parliament, be it an individual in your constituency surgery or an issue across your constituency or at legislative level in Parliament. So just that sense of showing, I think, more young women, what are women involved in politics and the difference they're making, I think is hugely important. And that's, politicians, we all, you will have done this, Judy, we all have a responsibility to actually get out and about and be presenting that image and presenting that. It's not just an image, it's a fact that women can make a huge difference in politics. So I think that's part of getting more women involved. But it is, this issue of the culture of the organisation is hugely important. And I think this is where, we touched on it talking about strong men, and I talked about the sort of aggressive and vitriolic terms of debate that we see and hear today. And that has happened over the recent years. And I think, sadly, that will put women off coming into politics. And there are women who are no longer in the House of Commons, who I know who stepped down because they just felt that what they were going through in terms of social media attacks, what they were feeling in terms of the atmosphere they were operating in, they just didn't feel they could actually do the job they wanted to be doing. And so we need to do something to change that atmosphere and to change those terms of debate so that we get a more respectful sense of debate. We're on different sides in the House of Commons because although we all want to make a difference and improve people's lives, we have different views as to how you get there and what your priority aim should be. But you can argue those out. You can argue them out absolutely robustly, but do so with a degree of respect for the other person and their views. And I think if we can change some of those attitudes, then that will also help.
And last question here. This is complete discrimination in favour of Australians. Here we go.
Hello, I'm Hannah Bretherton from the Lao China Institute here at King's. Thank you so much for your time tonight, all of you. Every International Women's Day, it feels like we have the same conversation and nothing much has changed. And I think the data shown tonight demonstrates that. If Julia and Theresa, if you could prioritise one social or economic issue in the next year to try and push the needle on gender equality, what would it be?
Well, I've been answering the questions all evening, so perhaps you should go first.
Okay, that's entirely fair. That's entirely fair. Very hard to pick one, but both here in the UK and in Australia and in so many other parts of the world, the last period of time has been defined by discussions around women and violence, and they've been in people's conversations for different reasons. I mean, here, the murder of Sarah Everard, the policing issues, all of that, I think, has meant that gender and violence has been the topic of conversation here. In Australia, it's been very directly connected with politics, with young Australians. I'm thinking of the very courageous young Brittany Higgins telling her story about being raped in Parliament House. I think if we can have those conversations the way we need to make change, that's, you know, the top issue.
And I was going to say something which in a sense follows on, is sort of linked to that, and we've touched on it already, which is that I think the online issues are particularly significant for women. And I particularly worry about a generation of young women now coming through whose mental health is being severely impacted by what they experience online. And I think dealing with some of these online issues is necessary if women are going to be able genuinely to come forward. I think, sadly, these issues are potentially setting women back in terms of their ability to get into the workplace, the lack of confidence, lack of self-esteem that is generated by some of the terrible things that they see, receive and experience through social media.
Well, we do have to bring our session to an end. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to every question, but I am going to give Theresa the last word. What Kelly's research does is it shines a light on community attitudes, and politics, democracy at its heart is about winning hearts and minds, and that's the way we decide to change our society and change our world. As we look forward to International Women's Day tomorrow, what can you say about that path before us for changing hearts and minds?
Well, the first thing I think I would say is, I mean, Kelly was right. Her figures were disappointing, in some senses depressing.
I know, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I didn't make them up.
And there are messages behind those figures, which I'll come on to. But I think we mustn't lose heart. We mustn't feel that somehow that we've been at this a long time and, oh, God, there was still those figures look like that. Because we have made progress and we will continue to make progress. And I think it is about changing hearts and minds. But for us as women, I think a lot of this is about us having the confidence to speak about these issues, having the confidence to portray that image of women that can start to change some of those attitudes, talking about the issues like violence, actually being willing to come up front and to express those. This gives me, it's slightly off-piste, but it gives me opportunity. One of the most moving moments in the House of Commons since I went on the backbenches was one of the early debates on the domestic abuse bill, when Rosie Duffield, the Labour MP for Canterbury, stood up and started to describe emotional abuse, coercion and control. And about halfway through her speech, it dawned on everybody in that chamber she was describing her own experience. And it was absolutely chilling. Women having the confidence, but also the courage to come forward and talk about their own experiences is so important, because if we don't do that, then the message will never get through to those who think that these sorts of attitudes towards women are correct and perfectly acceptable. So we have to stand up to the plate, step up to the plate. And huge thanks to all those women who've been victims and survivors who've had the courage to do that.
Absolutely, thank you. You to join me in concluding tonight's event. Can I ask you to join me in thanking Kelly and the team at Ipsos Mori? Yes, they don't generate the numbers we'd like, but they generate the numbers that shine a light on the issues we need to know. It's been a huge amount of work, and Kelly, thank you for that.
You're welcome, the whole team there.
And can you join me too in thanking the very generous Theresa May for being with us tonight, for giving up her time, and for a truly engrossing conversation.